Hi, and welcome to SimFest 2022 Hobby Edition, a festival celebrating simulation games that involve jobs and hobbies. I'm Jemima, part of the community team at Oric Digital, and we'll be showing you Brewmaster today, a simulation game about homebrewing. Brewmaster uses a realistic chemistry simulation and lets you brew your own beers, create recipes, enter competitions, unlock equipment, and teaches you the process of brewing in an authentic way. I'm joined today by Jack from the Oric Digital team and Justin Hawke, owner of Moor Beer Company in Bristol. And we'll be talking about brewing beer in Brewmaster, brewing beer in real life, and hearing about Justin's experiences of owning his own award-winning brewery. We're also joined by Ellie, an associate designer from Oric Digital working on Brewmaster. During the stream, she'll be behind the scenes playing the game and brewing a beer whilst we talk, so a big thanks to her as well. Ellie, if you want to give us a nice slow tour of the brewing space and tasting room, and then we can do introductions at the same time. So Jack, do you want to intro yourself and say what you do on the team?
Hey, yeah, of course. So I'm Jack. I'm a senior programmer, and I'm the lead programmer on Brewmaster. So I'm basically responsible for making sure all of the technical side and the code side of the project goes ahead. And so I was put onto this project because my background is in science, admittedly not chemistry, but we have a chemistry simulation under the hood. So obviously that's very important to get all of that simulation stuff kind of right.
And your background, is it physics, yours?
Yeah, physics.
Yeah, I mean, it's all maths. It's quite similar, right?
They're basically the same, all of them.
I thought so. And Justin, thanks so much for joining us today. Could you do a little intro to yourself as well and to Moor Beer?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks. And really pleased to be part of the game. It's quite exciting, and the graphics are looking amazing. So I'm originally from California, but I'm the owner and head brewer of Moor Beer Company. We've been going for 15 years now. We're called Moor because we used to be in the levels and moors of Somerset, which is an area near Glastonbury where the festival is held. We moved the brewery to the center of the city of Bristol about 8 years ago. And we also have a tap room in Bermondsey in London. So hopefully we'll see you guys down at those locations as well.
Yeah, it was also me and Peter, the producer on Brewmaster. We went down to Moor Beer, which is actually just like 2 minutes down from my flat. Yeah, we went to visit. We spent the day there. So we'll be also cutting away to footage of Moor Beer and some brewing that went on there when we visited. So we can see, how it happens behind the scenes as well. So as I said before, Brewmaster is an authentic beer brewing simulator, and we go through all the processes with an in-depth recipe as well. But Jack, do you need any previous brewing experiences to play Brewmaster, or can you come to it as a complete beginner?
Yeah, so good question. And no, you don't. The game is deliberately designed to be like as approachable as possible. So like obviously brewing is quite a complex process, but it will introduce you bit by bit as you go along. Obviously, if you already know your brewing, then you can dive straight in and grab the equipment and ingredients that you already know. But if you don't know any brewing, then there'll be various tools to like guide you through and familiarize you with the first bits you need to know, and then ways of expanding that knowledge if you want to learn more within the game.
Yeah, because we did an alpha not long ago, and we had a lot of people playing the game, and about half the people who tried it out and gave us feedback were actually brewers in real life, whether they did home brewing or like worked at a bigger brewery, such as Moor Beer. And yeah, we had loads of great feedback, and people were saying like it really captures like the different elements of what it is to brew and what you look for when you do it. And then we also had the other sort of like 40% of people who were playing it, they want to get into brewing, but it can be quite intimidating or like quite expensive. You need a lot of space. So a lot of people were sort of, I think, looking to the game as a way to teach them the basics and understand it a bit more before they took the next step. To jump in and do it. So here I'll put some footage of the equipment that is used at Moor Beer for brewing. So what are these big tanks called, Justin, in the main brewing space?
So we've got the two main tanks that you're looking at. One is called the mash tun, and the other one is called the copper or the kettle. So the mash tun or the mash lauter tun, to be technical, is a vessel that we mix the grain and the warm water in. We create basically a giant vat of porridge. It's the exact same thing that did when I learned to brew as a home brewer. We just do it a lot bigger. So while the grain and the water is steeping in there, it's converting the starches into sugars and creating some sort of color and flavors that we're going to get in the beer from that, and also determines how strong the beer will be. We then transfer the liquid, which at that point is called wort, over to the other vessel, which was traditionally known as a copper because they were made out of copper. Nowadays, they're all made out of stainless steel, so we call them kettles. Ours is steam fired, and that allows us to boil the sweet wort and add hops to it at different stages to get bitterness, aroma, and flavor from the hops. So those are the two kind of main brewing vessels that I think you'll be seeing people working with here in the game.
Yeah, because we've got like just the same thing but much smaller as well. I think it's got one called the mash tun. I don't know if the other one's called the kettle as well.
Yeah, that there that you can see, that's
There
the
you go.
mash tun. So that's
Much
our little
smaller
mash
scale,
tun.
the equivalent.
The brilliant thing as well is the mash tun that you've got is effectively the exact same one that I learned to brew on as back in San Francisco in the mid '90s. So it was without shouting kind of brands out there. It was an orange insulated, effectively picnic cooler vessel, exactly like that.
There you go. You can learn it.
That is very realistic.
That's brilliant. And what sort of quantities of ingredients do you use for an average brew at Moor Beer? Because you'll see in the background, Ellie's measuring it. It's much like you can see all the quantities. You've got to pour it in as you go. But yeah, what sort of quantities do you guys use for this scale?
So in terms of brewing, there's lots of different metrics and measurements that people will use depending on where you're located and which language you want to speak in. So when we brew a batch of beer, it would be equivalent to, in the UK, we would say 20 UK brewers barrels. In the US, that's about 30 US brewers barrels, because all the volumes are different. Or to make it really simple in metric, it's about 3,300 liters or 33 hectoliters. So to produce a beer of that size, we'll typically be using anywhere from half a ton to a ton of malt, depending on how strong we want it to be. Sometimes even more than a ton if we're going for a really strong beer. We'll mix that with thousands of liters of water, and in the end, we'll wind up with a finished beer of around 3,300 liters.
Jeez. Yeah, when we were there, like we saw them pouring in the little sacks in the game. They had like the massive ones pouring it in at this sort of funnel you can see at the top. So when you're brewing beer on that scale, is the quantity of ingredients just a scaled up version of home brewing, or do the ratios change?
I started out just scaling up my homebrew recipes, and what you determine from there is effectively how efficient your equipment is and how your equipment works. The really interesting thing with brewing is that it's as much of an art as it is a science, and it will vary hugely depending on where you are and what equipment that you're using. So if you took a recipe that someone used, it's really only a guide that you really need to adjust based on your equipment. So being at a professional scale means we've probably got more efficiencies than you get out of a lot of the home brewing equipment. And also for us, when we're talking about a ton of malt, the cost implication is a lot higher than as a home brewer if you're talking about kind of 5 to 10 kilos. So we got to make sure that we're getting the most out of our ingredients. We want to get the optimum use out of them, but still use the best quality so that it's really easy to get inferior quality products and cheapen beer that way. But we try and optimize things on how we're actually using it in the equipment.
That makes a lot of sense. So is that sort of the main differences between brewing on a homebrew scale and then a beer brewing on a large scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really down to efficiencies, how your equipment performs, and also I'd say some certain bits of equipment can be difficult to miniaturize. So we can perhaps do things on our equipment that you wouldn't be able to on a homebrew. But at the end of the day, you can make homebrew of equal quality to professional brew. That's absolutely certain. So really it's about getting your processes right, keeping everything clean, keeping it consistent.
And how do you monitor the temperature of your beer throughout the process? How much leeway do you have, like if it's too high or too cold?
That's one of the things that really helps us on the professional scale. So we use a lot of temperature sensors on the various vessels, as well as some temperature sensors that we might use from a handheld perspective and put inside of things. So that's one thing that is very expensive to miniaturize and to control, where we're looking for arguably a much finer temperature control during particularly the fermentation process is super critical to get that right, to make sure things don't get too hot or too cold. The implications, if they're too hot, you're going to get potentially some really bad flavor out of that, or you might actually stress or kill your yeast if it gets way too hot. And if it gets too cold, then the yeast is likely to just go to sleep and stop working. So we can't afford for those things to happen on a professional level. So we'll put in technologies to avoid that from happening. There are some things you can get at a homebrew level to do that as well. There's heating pads and cooling jackets and things like that that people can do. I've seen people convert refrigerators to do temperature controls. Homebrewers are incredibly creative, and it's a fantastic hobby to allow you, especially if you like to tinker with things, to be able to do those kind of things. But at a professional level, we've got big expensive equipment to do that for us.
And if the temperature had gone too high or too low, would you lose like the whole batch, or is it like you can save it still? Like if you killed your yeast, would that be it?
Yeah, that would be it.
Oh,
Yeah, if you've gone too high and you've created those bad flavors or higher alcohols or whatnot, it's basically down the drain. So we don't want to do that with 3,300 liters.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it happens. I've dumped beer as a home brewer. I've dumped beer as a professional brewer. If something's broken, this is just
happens sometimes.
part and parcel of doing it. Not often.
So, how do we measure the temperature of brewing in Brewmaster in the game, and how can players control this? And how closely do players have to control this as well?
So in terms of the game, like because we're simulating the temperature under the hood, we can just read what it is. So we can cheat in a way that you can't do in real life. But in the game, if you actually have there we can see it now, the X-ray mode, which is like supervision into what's going on within the container. But that's not realistic. So there are various like temperature tools within the game. So you can put a thermometer in, and if you want that more realistic experience rather than having your X-ray mode, that's slightly unrealistic. And then in terms of heating temperature tools, so the various different containers, some of them have different like insulation factors, and we have like heat pads and burners and things. So the heat pads are mentioned by Justin earlier, and then on the side there's the kitchen hob that you can use for your first brews before you like upgrade to your more advanced heating equipment. But then also on the other end we also have things like there's a specific fermenting container which has a jumper on it, recycled to enable you to keep it at the right temperature.
That was really cute. We shared it on social, the little stripy jumper.
Yeah, I do like that one. There's also like a modified picnic cooler, which is like a home brewing classic, so that you can use that.
Cool. And because we might have some beginners to brewing and beer in the chat, Justin, can you tell us what the gravity of beer is, how you measure it, and what does it tell you about the final beer you will create?
So gravity is the term that we as brewers would use to determine how much sugar is in a beer. We create the sugar, as we were saying earlier, in the mash tun by mixing the warm water and the grain together. So that will convert the starch to sugar, depending on the type of malt that we're using, how much of it we're using. It will create more and more extract or make the gravity higher and higher. And then depending on where we start and how far we ferment it, that will determine how much alcohol is produced. So it's really important that we measure gravity at all stages. So we start measuring gravity in the mash tun, so we know that we've created enough initial sugar to start. And then at multiple stages across the brewing process, we'll remeasure it to see how the yeast is fermenting it until the final point where we know where it finished and therefore how much alcohol we've got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the sugars come from the grains, don't they? I know when we went to Moor Beer, we were given some of the grains to sort of chew, and they're quite sweet in your mouth.
Tastes good.
Yeah, it was nice. That was like, because you get ones that are slightly different roasted as well, and they have different sweetnesses as well.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so the maltsters are the people who turn a grain into malt, and what they'll do is they'll get it wet and allow it to start to germinate. And just before when it starts kind of sprouting little rootlets, they'll stop that process by heating or kilning the malt. And the longer and hotter that they heat or kiln the malt, the darker and darker it'll get. So that's why you'll get some beers that are really pale in color, or some beers that are black, like a stout or a porter. We'll use a proportion of darker roasted malts like that. And then there's some malts that are what are termed as sort of crystallized or caramelized. And what happens there is the maltster starts to do a little bit of that starch to sugar conversion for us, and then they stop it by kilning it, and they create effectively like a crystallized sugar on the outside of it, which is really nice to eat and adds a great complexity to beer if you use it.
Yeah, when we were at the brewery as well, we tried some of the liquid. Is it the wort that's really sweet? Yeah, it was nice.
Yeah,
It was like a sort of Ovaltine drink. So Jack, do we measure the gravity in Brewmaster?
Yes, we do. But in Brewmaster, it's sort of the other way around. So in real life, you want to know the sugar content, and then you use your gravity to measure, to work out what that is, or to estimate what it is, really. But in the game, we simulated like how much sugar is dissolved, and then we use that to calculate what the gravity is. So it's sort of slightly backwards, but yeah, it's such an important like concept to homebrewing, and for a lot of homebrewers as well, it's like how they estimate what their alcoholic percentage is. So yeah, spent a lot of time thinking about that, and trying to get those numbers right and get that to add up correctly. But yeah, and you can see, I think on the X-ray mode, like specific gravity is one of the key stats that gets listed. So yeah, as it's so important.
And what other sort of things do you measure in the brewing process, Justin? I think when we were at the brewery, they measured pH levels as well.
Yeah, pH is one of the things that we do measure, and also homebrewers can measure. There's different ways of doing that. There's a really basic way with having some paper that will change color, and that's typically how a homebrewer would do it because it's economically feasible to do that. You can also get pH meters of, let's say, various degrees of accuracy and durability. I think what you find a lot of times when you buy equipment as a home brewer, if you go for that kind of electronic but low cost solution that's out there, they typically are not very accurate and they don't last very long. So as a brewer, we're really making a lot of key decisions on what these metrics are. So at the professional level, we don't want that variability. So we've got to get more sort of like lab-based type quality equipment. But by measuring the pH, that's really critical because certain reactions will occur and certain environments will be created for the beer and the wort that are either more or less favorable. So we start measuring pH first in the mash to make sure that we've got the right pH level of for the grains to convert. And we typically want that to be around kind of 5 to 5.5. People would say 5.3 is the kind of sweet spot if you're looking for just a number, but that'll vary widely depending on what type of beer you're trying to brew. And then ultimately another metric that's really important is the pH of the finished beer itself. Typically, depending on the style, we're looking at something below 4.2 on the pH scale. And the reason for that is creating an environment where harmful bacteria won't grow. So nothing that's going to kill you that can kind of live in beer below 4.2 pH. That's really important for us to measure and keep in mind.
Is that something that we measure in Brewmaster as well, Jack?
No, not at all. So we just completely ignore it. It's one of those design decisions that it doesn't add a lot. It's something you need to get right to get your beer right, but it's not used too much as like a homebrewers as a creative lever. And like as you say, most homebrewers don't have access to like advanced pH measuring. It's just something that you can use to refine your process as you get more technical and involved.
On a bigger scale.
Yeah.
So here we can see the grains steeping in the mash tun. How long does this take, and how do you maintain the temperature at such a large quantity?
So your mash time will depend on what mix of grains you're using. Let's say as a rule of thumb, people would say an hour is kind of a rough time scale. And from a temperature perspective, if you're going for what is known as a single infusion mash, which is exactly what we're doing here, so we're effectively mixing all of the grain and all of the initial mash water together at one time, In that scenario, you're looking for something between kind of 65 to 70 degrees C as your temperature for that, and typically about an hour's worth of time. What you're doing there is you're allowing the optimal environment for the different enzymes, which are alpha and beta amylase, to do those conversions of the starch to the sugar. Now, that actually can happen, particularly if you're using British malt, because British malt tends to be very what we call modified, and what that means is the sugars are really easy to access. So what we actually find in real world scenario in the brewery is that starch to sugar conversion can pretty much be finished in about 20 minutes, depending on what kind of brew we're making. If it's stronger and there's a lot more malt in the vessel, particularly if there's a lot of darker malts or whatnot, we might leave it for an hour or for longer. But yeah, an hour as a benchmark is a good kind of number to kind of target.
And how does that work in the game, Jack? Do people have to sit there for a whole hour whilst their stuff is steeping?
No, we have the ability to speed up time at will. So you've got in the top left is the stopwatch for like quick changes to time, and then by the fridge you can see there is the calendar. So if you need to skip days or weeks of time, you can just go right ahead.
Yeah, we figured that wouldn't be the funnest bit to simulate.
No.
So here we can see the grains coming out the bottom of the mash tun at Moor Brewery. Once the grain's been boiled and the sugars have come out, what's it called when it comes out the bottom then? And what do you do with this waste product?
So once we're done with the grain, we call it spent grain. What we do is we send it off to a local farmer to be used for animal feed. So it's quite a green way of getting rid of what some people would consider waste. As a home brewer, I guess you can also go to some local farmers and try and get rid of it that way as well.
Yeah, we tried some of it as well, and then it's like tastes very porridgey, but all the sugar's gone out of it, so it's not as tasty as before it goes in.
No. Some people use it in baking bread as well.
Oh, really? You can bake bread from it? Oh, that's cool. And you could have a nice sandwich with your beer. And here as well, footage of some brewing equipment with a reflective jacket that we saw at Moor Brewery. What is this for, and do all brews need to be kept at the same temperature?
So what we're looking at is what we call a fermentation vessel. So once the wort has been boiled in the kettle and the hops have been added to it, we cool it down to the right temperature for fermentation. Again, really depends on what style of beer you're making and what type of yeast you're using. If you're brewing or making an ale, typically you want to be fermenting it at around 20 degrees C, kind of give or take. And if you're fermenting a lager, you want to be at about 10 degrees C, give or take. So this vessel will allow us to take the sweet wort, the sweet hopped wort that we've produced. We add yeast to it. The yeast eats the sugars and creates carbon dioxide, alcohol. It produces more yeast and creates some other flavor kind of compounds that you can smell and taste in the beer.
So how do you come up with new recipes, Justin? Are new flavors created with different ingredients, or with the same ingredients with different temperatures and quantities create different beers?
So we come up with new recipes based first on a target of what we want to get out of the beer. So we look at how strong do we want the beer to be, and therefore how much malt do we need to use. We figure out what color we want it to be. So that's different, trying to mix those different colors of malts from anywhere from very pale to black and everything in between. We figure out what flavor profile we want it to have, so we can change those ratios of the different types of grains depending on what we're looking to get out of it. And then, of course, that's just the grain side of things. Water has a huge part to play, so we look at the water chemistry. If we want a beer to accentuate the bitterness, then we'll perhaps add or remove certain ions from the water by doing what's a process that home brewers would know is something called Burtonization. So adding something like gypsum, which is like a white powder that you can get in a homebrew shop, adding that into the brew will change the flavor profile to accentuate the bitterness. If we want to accentuate the fullness of the beer, then we might change the ions to be a bit more sort of chloride heavy. So we can play around with those things. And then, of course, the other ingredient that everyone loves to play with these days is hops. So we'll do our hop selection based on whether we want it to be kind of herbal or woodsy or fruity, like tropical fruity or citrus fruity. There's hops for all variety of the spectrum. We'll add them at different stages to get bitterness, flavor, aroma out of the hops. And then the fourth ingredient that is the main kind of the four brewing ingredients is yeast. So depending on what type of beer we're going to brew, we'll select a yeast that's appropriate for that, and that will then add a further element of complexity to the beer.
So do you have like, because yeast you have to keep alive, right? Do you have like different yeasts living at the brewery, like different strains, or?
Little yeast
Yeah, we do.
house.
Yeah.
We do have a couple of what we call them yeast sprinks, or they're used for yeast propagation. So we use multiple strains of yeast in the brewery depending on which beer we're trying to brew. And it is a bit of a juggling act to keep them all alive. We'll typically keep our yeast alive for about 3 months for a particular strain, and then we'll grow it again in the lab and kind of grow it up. But as a home brewer, you have fantastic access to lots of different yeast to play with, and the beauty of it is you don't necessarily have to keep them alive. You can go back to the home brew store and start with a fresh one each time.
So how do recipes work in Brewmaster, Jack? Can you experiment and make up your own, and are there recipes to follow?
Yeah, so there are recipes to follow, and yeah, obviously if you know you're brewing, then you can dive right in and pick your ingredients, and the simulation should be true enough to life that you would end up with the kind of beer that you would expect from that choice of malts, hops, and yeast combinations. But if you don't know, then yeah, you can. There'll be recipes in game that you can just follow along to, and they'll guide you step by step as you go through, like what to add when, how long to leave it, what temperature it needs to be, and all of that. But then if you want to make your own recipe, then there'll be the support for that within game to make your recipe, and you can either do that from scratch, or you'll be able to do that by like copying a pre-existing recipe. So if you're like, oh, I like this recipe, but I want to swap out these hops for another hops, then yeah, there's a couple of ways to approach it.
And it'll tell you at the end what sort of thing you've created and the flavors.
Yeah, so you need to with your recipe then make it through in game to then see what beer you make. Otherwise, you cut out the entire game loop. You just
yeah, need to finish the recipe so the chemical simulation can create it for you. How
Yeah.
many beer styles does Brewmaster have as well?
I can't remember. It's something like 60 or something like this.
Sounds
So
about
there's
right.
quite a lot. Yeah.
How many beer styles do you make at Moor Beer, Justin?
Typically, throughout the course of a year, including our regular beers and our specials, we'll brew somewhere between sort of 40 to 50 different beers. Of course, there's a little bit less during the pandemic, but we'll look forward to that coming back to normal again. Our core stable of beers is usually about sort of 5 to 10 that we try and keep going all the time, and then have 2 or 3 different new ones each month.
Do you have what's your favorite one that you brew, and then what's your favorite one like that your customers buy the most of?
Ooh, good question. My favorite beer that we brew is Hoppiness, which is our 6.5% IPA. It's an homage to one of my favorite beers in the world, which is Bear Republic Racer 5. Ours is just a little bit weaker. So it's a fantastic kind of West Coast IPA, but it bring a lot of uh, British qualities to it as well. So we call it a crossover IPA, and in tribute to one of my favorite bands, DRI. So that's probably, if I had to pick one of ours as our Desert Island beer, that would be that. And in terms of what is our best-selling beer is a beer called Resonance that used to be called Norhop prior to that. So we just did a name change not too long ago because it was our bestseller, but we weren't really happy with the name. It's a 4.1% Citra Golden Pale, and it's rated top in its style in the world. So we're really proud of that, and it sells really well.
Wow, that's awesome.
I do like the Resonance beer myself.
When we were visiting Moor Brewery, there was also a smaller version of the equipment. Do you use this to make new recipes, or would you try a new recipe straight away in the like full size equipment?
So we've done both. We only got the pilot kit not long before the pandemic, which is a bit ironic because then we didn't get to use it for a little while. But now what we're doing is we are definitely using it for recipe development. But prior to that, it was just really knowing our brewing processes, the equipment that we have to work with, and our ingredients. So we would just go for a full-scale batch of beer, and it would kind of generally work out pretty much what we were aiming for each time. Sometimes we'd have to tweak something if we wanted to kind of repeat it, but yeah, we just kind of go for it.
Oh, wow. Do you have is there someone there whose official job is like beer taster to be like, yeah, I'm happy with this? Or is it like a group consensus for new recipes?
Yeah, I think myself and my brewery manager Tom, we basically spend our days and nights talking and thinking about these things. We get a lot of input, of course, from the rest of the team. We got a fantastic group of brewers, and they all give their opinions and input into the kind of things that we want to do, as well as the rest of the team in the company. And a nice thing is having the brewery taps that we've got in Bristol and London. We also get a lot of direct consumer feedback, so we can kind of take some of those things on board. But at the end of the day, I made more beer to brew the kind of beers that I like to brew. So that's generally what wins out.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great when we visited. So we did a tour around the back, but yeah, there's a space out front where you can try the beers. And we also we got this one given to us at the time. So they were explaining that this one sort of brews in the can. Like it was quite soft when I first got it a few weeks ago, and now it's hard. And they were saying like that's it finishes the process in the can.
Yeah, so we were the first in the world to kind of pioneer this technique, and we got recognized by CAMRA, which is the Campaign for Real Ale, for creating what was the first can-conditioned beer in the world. So what we do is the same process that we use for all of our beers. Actually, we allow the beer to finish its fermentation process. We then add back in the amount of sugar to create the carbonation that we want, make sure the yeast levels are right, and then we allow it to do its secondary fermentation in the can or in the cask or in the keg. The beer is exactly the same. So when they come off the canning line, initially they will be kind of squidgy, and then after a week or two they'll kind of not swell up and burst, but they'll kind of go firm, and that's when we do other samples as well. But that's one sample is the can's firm. Okay, it's done some of its carbonation. Now we need to go test the next things in it.
Yeah, that's really cool. So this one should be ready to drink now. I can try it in a bit. So here we can see it's Tom, who you just mentioned, actually, taking a sample from the large tank in the canning room. Is this where the fermentation happens? And what is this sample going to be used for?
Yeah, so we've got, in the brewery, we've got what we call the clean side and the dirty side. So it's really imperative as a home brewer or as a brewer, period, that to keep everything super, super clean. And that's probably my number one piece of advice for any brewer is cleanliness. That's like absolutely the first thing to get right. So what we've got it's more imperative once you're on the post-boil side of the brewing process. So when you create the wort initially in the mash tun, as we were saying, it's between sort of 65 to 70 degrees. Then we boil it. So boiling it will, of course, totally kill anything that could potentially be alive in the wort at that stage. So it's less essential that side of things is absolutely aseptic. But when it gets into fermentation, it has to be. So we've got an actual, like a physical barrier where we have different rooms. So in the fermentation room, we have all of our fermentation vessels. And at that point, we want everything to be super, super clean, even more so than on our dirty side, which isn't dirty. And we'll take samples constantly to check as you were saying, the gravity. So how much sugar is left in the beer. We'll check things like the yeast. So we'll see how much yeast is left in the beer, how healthy the yeast is. We'll check the pH to make sure that we've gone to those safe levels. And those are the types of, and as well as smelling it and tasting it, because that's a key indicator as well of, the beer is going the right direction. So those are the kind of things we'll be doing with the sample.
How do you check the yeast? How do you see that the yeast is doing what you want it to do?
The yeast is a microscopic organism. So what we do is we use a microscope. So we'll take a sample of beer and we'll effectively dilute it down a little bit and then literally put it on a slide into a 40-time microscope and just sit there with the counter and how many cells we see. We'll also do a little stain to it so that we can tell if the yeast is alive or dead. And then we can basically know based on our metrics and what stage of the brewing process we're in, whether or not we've got a healthy population of yeast and they're doing what they're supposed to do, or if there's a problem and we need to do something to fix it.
So what happens if it's too high or too low, the yeast levels?
It depends what stage in the process we're in as to what those levels should be. So if we're at the beginning of fermentation, the yeast level is too low, then we would need to add more yeast. If we are at the end of the fermentation process and we're looking to package the beer, and the cell count is too high, then we'll leave it for more time to allow more yeast to settle out of it. So there's different ways that you can control the amount of yeast that's left in the finished beer. We use the classic time and temperature. So we control the amount of yeast that settles out of the beer just by making it colder and for leaving it for longer, which we think is a nice kind of low intervention way of dealing with things in a much more natural process. The other two ways typically people could use or three ways people could use to speed that up. They could either use what's called a centrifuge, which is a very expensive and big piece of equipment that effectively accelerates gravity by spinning the liquid really fast and spins the yeast particles out of it, or the yeast cells out of it. That's one way of doing it, but by doing that, you also remove other flavor compounds that we would prefer to leave in the beer. You can use an agent that would be known as a fining. And typically finings would be made of something called isinglass, which are really fish guts.
Yeah.
It's the acidified aqueous solution of swim bladder for various fish that's used to make the yeast clump together. We think that's really disgusting and not a good way to deal with your beer, but that's the way that most breweries, particularly in Britain, deal with it. So we were the first to pioneer stopping that process here in the UK, and created what's called the unfined beer movement, and also as a side of that becomes vegan friendly. So we were the first to do a kind of a real big push on the vegan beer movement. The fourth way, I guess, that you could get rid of the yeast is filtration. So there's different types of things that you could filter the beer out with to reduce that yeast content. But like I said, it's really down to the brewer's preferences to what process that they want to use. We very much believe in the low intervention method. So for us, it's time and temperature. But if you've got a centrifuge, or you want to add fish guts, or if you want to filter your beer, you're welcome to do those things too. Probably not at a homebrew level. You might be able to filter, or fine it. You can fine it too.
And how does that work in Brewmaster, Jack, with like monitoring and maintaining the yeast levels?
So the yeast is all simulated, and there are various factors that we take into account when determining like how healthy the yeast is and like how that population will change. So the key things are to do with like the amount of sugar and the alcohol levels. But we don't have any of that filtering or that fining or any of that sort of stuff within the game.
Vegan beers brewing in Brewmaster.
It's all vegan by default.
So here's a shot of me adding hops in at Moor Beer. I was very excited about that. So when do you add the hops to the beer? Are there different types, and how much impact does this have on the beer?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways that you can add hops into beer. So hops come in multiple formats. Originally, they were only available in what was called a flower or a cone. So that's when you go and if you were to Google a photo of a hop, you'll see a picture of a beautiful sort of vine, probably climbing up a little rope, and there will be these beautiful like large leaves and then nice cones off of it. So really, what we want as a brewer is a gland inside of that's called lupulin, and it kind of looks like a yellow oily powder, and that is primarily the compound that we're looking to get out of the hop. There is some value as well in having some of the green material, and it's really a balance of the two. But effectively, we're looking for that lupulin. So historically, we would have just used whole flowers or cones. That's really, unfortunately, kind of falling out of favor globally as technology's improved. What companies have done is they kind of macerate or grind up the hops into something called pellets. They look just like a rabbit pellet that you go and buy like in a pet shop to feed your rabbit. Goes through the same kind of dye process of molding them together. And what that does, there are some advantages to having pellets, and we use both actually in the brewery. The advantage to having a cone is you get a much more natural, unaltered expression of the hop, which we think is fantastic and unique. The advantage to having a pellet is that you can access those lupulin glands quite a lot easier, and also some of the excess green material has been removed from the pellet. So it does change the expression of the hop quite a bit and how easy it is to work with. So we think the combination of the two works best. There's also new technologies that have come on board to try and further refine those lupulin glands and the hops even more. So there's different kinds of oils and extracts that you can get, and even some sort of powdered materials. So hop merchants are always looking at new ways that they can give brewers creative tools to use on the hopping side. So in our brewery, we use whole hops mostly in the kettle. So we'll add those in when we're boiling, and then we use hop pellets when we're doing our dry hopping. So when the fermentation has finished and the yeast has kind of settled out to the level that we want it to be, we've then got a separate vessel that we put hop pellets in, and we recirculate the beer through those, and it kind of like infuses extra hop aroma and flavor into the beer, and gives us the kind of the profile that we're looking for.
How do the hops get added in Brewmaster, Jack? What's going on with the chemical simulation when these are added?
Yeah, so we just have the one sort of hops, and they're all within the sort of like the bags, sort of like the mesh bags that you can sort of attach to the side of the container. They won't actually look like they are doing in the game at the moment, so they're just being changed at the moment. But then when under the hood in the simulation, there's various things that are going on. So there's the process for adding bitterness, is to do the alpha acids. Now I'm not, Justin probably more familiar with this chemistry than I am, but there's like a slight chemical change that goes on when you have the right conditions at the right temperature. So we simulate that side of things, and then we also simulate how the flavors from the hops get added into the liquid. But then also, as you're doing it with the within the boil, like some of those flavors degrade over time. So we simulate that because like the time at which you add your hops is quite important. One of the things that homebrewers like to be able to play with. So we've tried to like include in the simulation all of those factors that are sort of key to that expression for the player.
So here we can see the canning production line at Moor Brewery. Do you mainly use cans, and if so, why?
So our beer we put into various containers. So we can either be for draft beer into what's known as a cask, or into a keg. So the difference between a cask and a keg is if you go into a British pub and you see people sort of pulling on a hand pump like that, then they're pumping the beer up from a cask. And if you see them going to typically like a wall and just like flipping a lever and beer comes out, and then they close the lever, that's typically coming out of a keg, which has excess CO2 or gas that's used to push the beer out of the keg. The third way would be to put in like a smaller pack for people to consume at home or on the road or on the beach or wherever. We think we do cans. We think the cans are the best format for packaging beer because they protect the beer from light and oxygen in a way that bottles can't. And we used to bottle our beer before we switched to canning about 2015. We changed to cans. And I think if you go across and you see now as a format, especially for fresher beers that you want to enjoy and lock in all that freshness and consume them quickly, then the can is the best tool for that.
Mm-hmm. And how many cans of beer do you make a month? Do you know?
So every time we can a batch of beer, so if our batches are 3,300 liters, we do two different size cans. So we've got a 330 ml can, and we've got a 440 ml can. So out of a batch of beer, we'll get about 10,000 of the smaller cans or 7,500 of the bigger cans.
Jeez, it's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah.
So we do bottles in Brewmaster. It's more common for homebrewers to use bottles. I think canning equipment's just quite on a small scale is quite hard to get. Although apparently Tom was saying he did know someone, just one person who had some sort of homebrew canning, but it's not common. But what kind of custom beer packaging does Brewmaster have, Jack?
Yeah, so as you say, there's your beer goes into a bottle at the end when you finish the brewing process, and then you can switch out between a variety of different bottle sizes, and then bottle colors as well. And then also you'll be able to customize like the label and the name of your beer, so you get to play with various factors to tune what it looks like, and then you get your lovely bottle of beer at the end.
And you can use it to decorate your workspace as well.
Yeah.
Which I think is great fun. And then something else players will have to decorate their space with. So we've seen throughout the stream the sort of living room space and the kitchen and stuff. So there'll be like posters you can put on the wall and like other things you could put around. We're going to have a Moor Beer glass in the game as well, which is really exciting. And we've got competitions and jobs in Brewmaster from different breweries, and we will also have a Moor Beer one in there as well. So yeah, you'll get in the game, you'll get a competition. I think it's either a competition or a job request from Moor Beer, and if you succeed and Moor Beer are happy with it, then you get a cup, Moor Beer glass you can display, which I think is really cool. So here as well, you can see the warehouse of Moor Beer. So how much beer do you store in your warehouse, and how long is it stored? Or are these ones to go straight to like pubs and things?
So we've got lots of different storage areas depending on what stage of the storage that we're in. We've got some that are temperature controlled to be at around 20 degrees C, and that's because we do that secondary fermentation or the secondary conditioning that we do and that we're known for. That optimally works at around kind of 20 degrees C, so we actually keep that area controlled to that temperature throughout the year. So once we've initially packaged the beer, we'll stage it in that area for a while to allow that fermentation to happen. At that point, we'll then move it into our warehouse that we want more kind of around 10 degrees C, or what's kind of typically known as cellar temperature. That helps to preserve the beer a bit longer. And that would be true of our ales. For our lagers, when they come out of the tank, they're already around near enough freezing temperature, so about kind of 0 or 1 degrees. And we want to keep those as cold as possible throughout their life cycle. So we've got a separate container that's chilled down to 4 degrees for that. We just basically continue to lager and mature them there, and then get them out to trade to get drunk as quickly as possible.
Yeah. And it's we mentioned a little bit earlier about cleaning equipment and how important it is. How do you clean the equipment?
Yeah, cleaning is absolutely essential for everything. So we've got lots of different processes that we have to go through for cleaning. The first would be to just generally rinse everything out, which would be either from like a hose or a power washer. And then we've got various levels of detergents that we can add into things to kind of clean off anything that's kind of baked on or stuck onto something. And then the final stage would be making sure that anything that might be microscopic living in nooks and crannies, we can get rid of that. So we do that through a series of enzymes and acids and things to make sure that those are cleaned and sanitized. And then we check everything at the end of it. When we get to the stage where we're looking to actually ensure that everything's microbiologically okay inside of the tanks and the canning line and all the rest of it. So we'll use enzymes and acids and things to finish that sterilization process. And then we actually check and make sure that that's worked. So we use an ATP monitor, and we basically swab various areas inside of the vessels and inside the canning line. And we run it into a machine that basically scans it fluorescently for any growth. If there's anything there, then we just re-clean it again.
Wow. And is that something that do we have equipment cleaning in Brewmaster? And if not, why not?
Well, definitely not to that level, no. It's not. It's something that you need to do, but it's not like a key part of the gameplay. And like, the cleaning is basically to the stage of you take your brewing equipment that you've used, and then you can go to the sink and press clean, and then it's all clean, and then and good to go again.
Yeah, so when
that's awesome. I wish we had that button.
Yeah, when we're sort of creating our simulation or management games, we try and simulate like the best bits of it, because we also have a space agency game, and we had some like real rocket scientists play it with us, and they were like, the only thing you haven't simulated is all the paperwork, and I'm glad you skipped that bit because it's just not so fun. So yeah, we sort of made the choice with Brewmaster to skip the in-depth cleaning. But who knows if it's requested heavily, maybe a DLC for cleaning equipment. Cool. So we can do some tasting now. We've got some more beers for me and Jack to try on just try on the stream. Do you have any with you, Justin? I'm just lying around.
I can go get one if you want.
That's okay. You could talk. I'm sure you know them very well. So I've got the stout. This is the one we were brewing in the footage you've been seeing today. So we can try some of that. So this is made with like dark malts as well as the light ones. Oh wow, it's very dark.
Yeah, that's correct. So stout traditionally, there you go.
Nice.
Beautiful kind of black color and nice kind of tan full head on that.
Oh, that's
yeah, so that's.
I'll just get mine from the fridge.
Yeah, get yours as well.
Yeah, no, you'd make a stout with typically we use roasted barley as one of the key adjuncts to turn the beer black. Interesting kind of story in terms of how that became a popular way of brewing. It was basically a tax dodge in Ireland. So there was a certain period in time where the government would tax brewers based on the amount of malt that they used. So to try and get away without paying all of the tax, Guinness Brewery basically got the maltsters to roast some barley instead of turning it into malt first. And they used a percentage of that in their brew instead to arguably to cheapen it, but it created a different flavor. And obviously Guinness has gone from strength to strength over the ensuing kind of 150, 200 years since they've done that. So so it worked out. It makes a great addition to the flavor and the profile of the beer.
I love that.
Very cool.
So what do you look for in a great tasting beer? Like, because I know with like wine, it's like you're smelling it and stuff, and you like swirl it on the glass. How does that work with beer?
So beer tasting would be, I guess, similar to wine tasting, but we do one extra step, which is we swallow the beer. First thing that you want to do is you want to assess the beer in the glass for what it looks like. So what you're looking for the beer is what color it is. Of course, if you're drinking a pale ale and it's black, there's a problem there. If you were drinking a stout and it was clear, there's probably a problem as well. Although there is also something called like a white stout. But that's an aberration that my friend made up as a joke. So yeah, you look at the color of the beer. You assess how clear the beer is. And again, that's a very subjective thing and will depend on the style. We prefer all of our beers to have a little bit of a haze to it that shows a little bit of life and body, but without having something that is like soup.
Yeah.
So that's how we like it. And then you want to look at the carbonation of the beer. So again, depending on beer style, you want to see what that head looks like that's on there. Is there enough carbonation? Is there too much? So you'll assess it visually first, and then you'll smell it. So you want to look for what the profiles are coming off of it. So are you getting any malty kind of breadiness coming off of it? You're getting some fruitiness from the hops, or you're getting some kind of interesting esters like clove or banana coming off of the yeast. So you'll smell it, then taste it. Similar sort of things you're looking for in it when you taste it. The critical thing with tasting beer is that you want to swallow it. And the reason that you're doing that is you're looking for the bitterness at the back of the tongue, because that is a really essential element to the quality of a beer, is getting that bitterness in there, because otherwise you would just have a sweet liquid that would become really cloying and horrible to drink after a very short period of time. So it's getting that right balance. And in my opinion, and in our opinion as a brewery, the best beers are beers that have a high degree of drinkability, some people would call sessionability, and a high degree of balance to the beer. I think historically that word balance and drinkability might have been considered a bad thing, because effectively marketeers had turned that into meaning something that was very sort of bland and watery. And unfortunately, that's the way that the public started to perceive those terms. So they wanted to have things that were much more outlandish. But at the end of the day, when people kind of rebelled against boring, bland beer, whether that was what people would term yellow fizzy lager, which which when you get a fantastically brewed lager is one of the best things you'll ever drink, but the yellow fizzy stuff is horrible, or what people used to call boring brown bitter, which is also completely wrong because if you get a fantastic pint of bitter in a pub, it should definitely not be boring or brown.
Yeah.
So what really matters is getting that drinkability. So I want a full amount of flavor in the mouth, that perfect balance between the kind of the malt, the hops, the sweetness, the bitterness, and that drinkability, or what we call sessionability, that ability to drink 10 pints of it responsibly, of course, over a period of time. But your mouth wants to be able to drink 10 pints of that beer. If all you can do is have a sip of it, you're like, that sip was amazing, but I wouldn't want to drink a half a pint of it. Those aren't the kind of beers that we're really interested in brewing or drinking.
Yeah, completely. And how does the beer tasting work in Brewmaster, Jack? How did the team approach this?
So obviously, unfortunately, you can't taste your beer in the game. But yeah, we look at all the key stats of the beer and show them to the player, and you get like a nice, visual inspection of it. And then look at all those key stats that Justin's mentioned, and then it will come up with a suggestion of what styles that your beer matches the stats for.
Okay, last question each as well. What's one biggest bit of advice you'd give people looking to get into home brewing?
So the biggest piece of advice for any aspiring brewer, or I guess, would be two things really. One, keep it clean. So that's cleanliness. Make sure you got your equipment clean, and everything that you do, from your processes, your vision, make sure everything is clean, that you have a purpose and a direction for it. The other bit of it, I would say, is the sociability of brewing. So brewing, at the end of the day, you're making beer. Beer is fun. Beer is meant to be, drunk and shared with people, and experiences and sociability. And some of the most fun times I had were, when I got into homebrewing, was joining a homebrew club and talking to other like-minded people, learning from them, just having great experiences together. So, gamers get online and have communities that they can do together. And if this inspires you to go out and, and actually try homebrewing on your own, and if you've got the space and the ability to do it, because it can be kind of messy and it can dominate a lot of space in a lot of your life, then go out and join some clubs and interact with some people and share some experiences.
And we do actually have on our Discord as well, which you can join. We've got a link to it on our Steam page. We have brewers in there who've played the game and they share their brewing recipes and things. So yeah, make sure to drop into the Aura Digital Discord to chat to our own brewing community. And Jack, what's a bit of advice you give to a first-time Brewmaster player?
That's a good question. I would say just enjoy it, and it will bring you all the things that you need to know as you go along, and then just experiment with it. So once you're familiar enough with it, then just play with it and see what you can make with it. And you can, one of the things is you have that freedom to play around with things without having to fill up your spare room with all of that brewing equipment.
Yeah, so, less risky to try new recipes out.
Yeah.
Cool. So that brings our stream to a close. Thanks so much, Justin, for joining us and for sharing your brewing experiences and knowledge. And thanks as well to Jack for talking us through the game. And big thanks to Ellie as well for brewing away in the background whilst we chatted. If you like the look of Brewmaster, make sure to wishlist it so you'll be the first to know when we have news or demos you can try. You can also sign up to our Brewmaster mailing list, which we link to on our Steam store page. People on this mailing list get development updates about the game and invites to any betas or alphas that we run. And yeah, as I said before, make sure to join our Discord as well to talk to our community about brewing, Brewmaster, or gaming in general. We'd love to have you. And make sure to check out Moor Beer on socials and on the website to see what they're up to as well. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of Simfest 2022.
Thank you.